Muito obrigado, Jorge, pela sua conferência. Valeu toda a preocupação com o visto e no final das contas deu tudo certo, que bom. E eu acho que foi excelente, valeu mesmo trazer você aí para essa conferência. A minha pergunta é sobre a personalidade dessa perfeição máxima. Não teria... Ele precisa ser pessoal. Por que não um Deus como um grande motor, o primeiro motor imóvel aristotélico? Ele teria todas as perfeições e seria impessoal. Por que personalidade acrescentaria a perfeição?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I want to say two things. So the first thing is that if the conclusion of the argument is that there is an ultimate perfect foundation where it's not personal, I still think that's a very significant result. So I want to just kind of pause there and celebrate. Like that would be a great achievement in philosophy. Okay? And then the second thing I want to suggest is that there is a concept of greatness, of perfection, that implies having a power to know everything, having a power to be good. These are great-making features that are built into this concept of greatness, so that if I'm praising somebody and I'm considering what would be a maximally valuable being, and I'm praising, I'm saying, you are eternal, you have all power, you are the unmoved mover, but you're not good, you don't have knowledge, then it seems like there's a cutoff to its total greatness. It's not as great as another thing I can see. And so it would be limited. There would actually be a boundary to this basic concept of greatness. Now this is tricky. I'm trusting that people have this concept and it can be brought out through example. But there are related concepts. So I think what can happen is people can focus on related concepts and miss this more fundamental concept, I think, that even explains these other related concepts. The deepest, most ultimate form of greatness includes the power to know all things, or at least to know as much as can be known, and to have all the perfections, including power, knowledge, and goodness, and necessary existence. So that's the basic thought.
Suppose you're a scientist and you see some quantum phenomena, it's 1917 or something, and you want to explain it. You're going to use the two principles you have, but your explanation isn't going to be maximal perfection. It's probably going to be electrons. And what electrons are supposed to do, they're supposed to have, it should be the simplest theory that has exactly the properties that are necessary to explain the quantum properties. You don't go to perfection. All you need is, so it's not, there are limits, but they're not arbitrary, but the limits are this. What exactly is needed to explain the data? So I wonder, with respect to, the cosmos, why is it that we want the simplest theory that exactly explains the data? And so you might think consciousness, maybe think consciousness can't be explained naturalistically, and so you become a panpsychist or something. Anyway, it's got to have consciousness, you might think, but you don't need to go to omniscience. It just needs to have consciousness, and then it has to have enough intelligence to create the universe, maybe. But again, not omniscience, and then enough power, but not perfect power. So they're limits, but they're not non-arbitrary.
Got it.
Sorry. Anyway.
Yes, that's a good question. So basically the question then is that we can explain some phenomenon without having to go all the way to maximal greatness, right? And I think that helps draw out a distinction here, because it's one thing to explain the cosmos. It's another thing to explain the features of the explanation of the cosmos. So what I'm saying is that the principle of explanation tells us that for any data, the probability that that data has an explanation, it's more likely it has an explanation than not, other things being equal. So we have an explanation for the cosmos. It may not be perfect. We don't need perfection. But now we can look at the data that there is this foundational explanation of the cosmos, and we can ask about its nature, its attributes. And we don't need perfection to explain the cosmos, but we need perfection to explain the basic attributes of the explanation of the cosmos. That's the basic idea. If it has a triangular shape, we can ask, what explains its triangularity? And you're not going to explain its triangularity in terms of triangularity, that's circular, so we need a deeper explanation. And the idea is that while you can explain limits in terms of an unlimited, it's not going to work to go the other way, where you explain the unlimited in terms of limits. So the foundation has to be unlimited. Does that make sense? Do you want to?
No,
There's more to talk about.
More I have to think about.
Okay.
Hey Josh, thanks for the talk. I thought it was great. I want to ask you a little bit about the starting point. I was a bit puzzled at the connection that you posted between seeking truth and seeking an explanation. So it's an invitation for you to say more about that. It strikes me that those are two different things and unrelated, especially unrelated in the way that you suggested that they are related. Truth, I take it, is, I'll assume here, and I think you share that assumption, correspondence between belief and reality. At least if we're talking about truth about beliefs and not positions, but and that's different from an explanation, right? A correspondence between a representation and what is being represented. And if I'm seeking that, if what I seek is merely accurate correspondence between my picture and what's being represented, that doesn't strike me as a search for an explanation for it. So I was just puzzled why you start there and not start with our desire for explanations, or the important role that seeking explanations has in sciences and all sorts of things. So this, I don't think this affects the rest of your argument, but as a starting point, it seemed a little, there was a jump there that I didn't quite understand.
Yeah, so two thoughts about that. The reason I wanted to start there is because I want to start with, I was thinking about, I like to build bridges between polarized groups. And so we talked yesterday about team atheist and team theist. And there's like this inability to even admit that there's evidence on the other side, right? Like there's this sort of this fight against each other. So one thing that I want to do is identify some virtues in people and then say, this isn't like trying to trap them, this is like highlighting, like this is an important virtue. And then I want to see if there's a way to go from that virtue to an interesting conclusion that they themselves would value. Okay? So that's part of why I'm trying to do that. I'm not 100% convinced that this is the most effective starting point. You're right that I don't have to start there. We can just start with observing explanations and build the argument that way. I think just to clarify, it's truth-seeking with respect to certain domains where like maybe I can know that it's true that I'm having thoughts right now, and I don't need to posit my thoughts to explain anything. I just sort of am aware of that. But when it comes to things about the universe, how do we get to truths about those things? And maybe there are multiple ways, but my sense is that that explanation seeking is, in certain domains, sort of the primary way that we get to the truth. And so that's why I give these examples. If common ancestry is no more likely an explanation than no explanation, how else could we come to believe in common ancestry of human beings or human origins or biological organisms? I can't see how, I can't introspect. Maybe you could have like a vision from God and God reveals that to you or something, but right, the way that we're trying to find out truth in these domains is through explanation seeking. So that's the idea.
Professor Josh, very simple question. Why don't you deal with the problem if the whole is a being? For example, it's not the same as the fallacy of composition, but how can I be certain that there is a whole? For example, why we can talk about universe just as a singularity of being, for example. It's not a whole. There is no universe as a whole, as a being, like something created. I think it's a different objection when you compare with the fallacy of composition. And I think, in my opinion, that you should deal with this objection. Thank you very much.
Yes, very, very astute question. So there is this objection that maybe there is no whole of reality. There's just things arranged. And so I dealt with it in a single little parentheses when I said whole or plurality. Okay? That was probably not enough to really answer it. But the idea is that, so here's a cup of water here. You think it probably had an explanation, didn't come from nothing. Here's another cup, it individually has an explanation. Now these two things, maybe they don't compose a whole, there's just a plurality. But you don't think that it's easier for multiple things to come from nothing than for individual things to come from nothing. In other words, the principle of explanation applies equally to wholes as to pluralities. And the explanation of the plurality might be the individual explanations of each of the individual things. Okay? But if you take the plurality of all things, and you say that that plurality is explained by the things within that plurality, even in an infinite regress, you get a circular or wholly immanent or internal explanation, which contradicts the principle of explanation, which is supported by our looking for outside explanations. Does that help?
Thank you. I'm not sure I understood you. So I'm sorry if my question showed that, but about the first part of your talk, maybe there is it seems for me a conflation between an epistemological level and a metaphysical level. When you contrast, you make a contrast between seeking truth and no explanation, and between no explanation and best explanation. Well, we can have a causal explanation and other kinds of explanation that they are not causal.
Sure.
Other kinds of explanation, like I just want to make sense of the data. So maybe the best explanation is that it is that there is no causal explanation. That's why not? Why, and that's the truth. So why you make a contrast between seeking truth and no explanation? Well, I'm seeking for truth, and now I realize that there is no causal explanation. Well, and I'm seeking for truth. So it seems that there is a conflation between the epistemological level, the seeking for truth and coherence, and the causal explanation. And of course, I can have an explanation for no causal explanation. For example, well, here we have a brute fact. Okay, so there is no causal, by definition, no causal explanation for this brute fact. Well, but I have to have an explanation for this. Yeah, no problem. But it's not a causal explanation. So I'm a little afraid that there's a conflation here, if I understood you correctly. So that's my point.
Good. Okay, so I discern two issues here. So one is conflating the epistemological, is it epistemological explanation or just epistemology with the metaphysics of explanation?
Epistemological level
Yeah.
of explanation.
Okay. Yes. So there, I'm thinking that there's an inference there, that there's an argument I'm trying to make that moves from epistemology to the metaphysics in certain domains of inquiry. For example, you have beliefs right now, like so you believe that you're sitting in a chair. Now you might think that that belief is more likely to be true than that it's produced in you without any explanation, or it's not even produced. But why do you think that? And that might be basic for you, that you just think that your belief that you're sitting in a chair is more likely to be true. But the thought is that in order to account for that belief that you have, there's this principle of explanation, metaphysical principle, that accounts for our ordinary epistemological stance towards all sorts of beliefs that we have. So that's a start of something. What you said about an explanation for no causal explanation, I think that's exactly right. So like, let's say that this cup exists and it has no causal explanation, and it has no explanation at all, even non-causal, let's just say. Then we could explain why it has no causal or explanation by the fact that perhaps it can't have an explanation, or it's unlike things that have an explanation. And I'm open to that. But then the burden is on the person who thinks that this cup has no explanation to justify that, right? So my whole argument is a reason to think that everything bottoms out in an ultimate explanation, but it's defeasible. So if you have some reason to think that the universe or some aspect is relevantly different from things that ordinarily have an explanation, then you can defeat the argument. But then we'd have to look at those reasons. And I mean, I've been looking at this carefully for many years. I've just not found any relevant difference. You can point to differences, but the question is it relevant to explanation? That itself would need to be justified. So I'm open to that, right? So I think you're absolutely right that you could justify that something has no explanation if you can give an account of its difference from things that have an explanation. Is that okay?
Professor, obrigado pela sua presença aqui, pela sua palestra. As pessoas religiosas gostam muito quando aparecem argumentos que provam a existência de Deus. Em geral, os filósofos que trabalham com isso são crentes. A maioria creio judeus ou cristãos. Vamos supor que nesse diálogo entre teístas e não teístas, o teísmo ganhe a batalha. E chegamos um dia que a filosofia tenha muito bem resolvido que Deus existe, esse Deus que os teístas colocam. E até os cientistas digam, não, de fato, os filósofos teístas estão certo? Existe um Deus pessoal. Isso não seria um tiro no pé das religiões teístas? Porque, se eu não me engano, o Deus Abraão é chamado pai da fé. Né? Essas religiões requerem a fé. Ou seja, será que não tem alguma coisa estranha? Na hora que eu provo, filosoficamente, pela razão pura, que esse Deus existe, para que ter fé? Para que religião?
I love that question. So I think the term faith is deeply ambiguous. In my view, you can have faith that's based on evidence. So for example, when I come back from a conference, sometimes my wife will pick me up, and I have faith in her that she's going to pick me up from the airport. I don't see her vehicle, I don't see her, I check the clock. It's past the time she's probably going to pick me up. But she's always picked me up before. I have evidence, I have reason to have that faith. So I think there is a notion of faith there, and sure enough she comes, right? I didn't see that she was there, but sure enough she comes. And my faith that she's going to come is based on evidence, it's based on reason. So while it's sort of a large topic, how to define faith, there are many different theories of that. I can just tell you that my view is that there is a legitimate notion of faith that's based on reason and evidence, and I actually think it's very important for theists, even just the beginning of my talk about there's this interest in a valuable belief and an interest in seeking truth. And I think that if theists really want to, I'll just be honest, just transform culture, they have to appeal to reason and evidence that is testable, that people can relate to. And I think that's consistent with trust. So that's my view. So there may be other notions of faith that my argument, if it's successful, is inconsistent with, in which case I would say, just by my own following of reason and evidence, those notions of faith are problematic.
So thanks for this very interesting argument. My question is about the moral property that you said this being, this maximal great explanation would have. How do you know? How could you measure the moral standard, like between good and evil? Couldn't that be a being who is greatly evil, for example, greatly evil? So this is how could you measure between good and evil in that sense?
Okay, so there might be a cluster of related questions, so we'll see if this gets at your question. So you're looking at a maximal being, and so one question is, why not have it be maximal power, maximal knowledge, and maximally bad, right? So it'd still be maximal, it's unlimited, has no boundaries, no limitations. So I have two thoughts about that. So one thought is that I think there's this more fundamental attribute of greatness, such that having maximal knowledge, power, and goodness gives you maximal greatness, whereas maximal knowledge, power, and then maximal badness gives you a limit with respect to maximal greatness, because maximal greatness is maximal value, maximal worthiness. If I have a technology here, I might pay more for it if it has more powers. If it has knowledge like maps, I'll pay even more for it. If it's bent on my destruction, it's bad, then I'm probably not going to buy it, right? It doesn't have as much value. The most valuable kind of thing would be good. Anything less than that would have a limit with respect to its goodness. So that's one thing. Another more complicated thing, which I could send you some papers on this, would argue that there's an asymmetry between good and bad, such that the very concept of maximal badness is actually incoherent. So we could talk more about that afterwards, but yeah.
Thank you. I want to start saying that perhaps I didn't understand you well, but you associate this being of greatest maximal greatness, the property of having no limits, and having an issue with this within a Christian framework, because there are legitimate limits to this being based on, for instance, human freedom, or the fact of undoing the past. So there are, it seems, clearly limits to this kind of being. So how your theory fits with that Christian frame?
Very good. So I have two thoughts on this. So one thought is that if it has some limits, they would be explainable by some core basic attributes. So for example, there's this theology that God is triune. Maybe that's explainable by God's maximal greatness, which implies the self-existent enjoyment of the great experience of love. And not just between two persons, but also the cooperation of loving, which requires then at least a third, but then simplicity keeps you at 3 so you don't go on. So that would be a way of explaining a certain kind of limit by prior attributes. Another thing that I think is worth distinguishing here is between logical limits. So the principle of explanation was that you give an explanation if it's conceivable. But if there's some sort of logical impossibility, then we still have a being that is as great as a being could logically, conceivably be. And there could be some logical limits that are entailed by greatness. They don't detract from greatness. So we have to distinguish between limits that are implied by greatness versus these logical limits. The logical limits that are implied by greatness versus other contingent limits that would detract from greatness. So the idea is that it's because the being is so great that it would have reason, its logic in its own nature. And if it has logic in its own nature, then it can't make a being do something freely without being made to do it, right? Like, of its own choice, that's going to lead to a contradiction. And so as long as the rules of reason are built into its nature, it's going to have logical limits. And that's consistent with its being maximal with respect to maximally conceivable. Does that make sense?
Yes, but anyway, you admit that there are some limits to that greatness.
Depends on how you define limit there. So the word limit, I think, is ambiguous. So in one notion, limit, people say, well, God is unlimited. And I think what they mean is that he's maximal with respect to greatness, which is going to imply some, right, like necessary existence, which means God can't stop existing. So there's a limit with respect to God's ability to stop existing. But that's just what you would expect from maximal greatness. So there is a notion of limit where I can say, yes, God has limits. There's another notion of limit where he doesn't. And my argument is focused on precisely the notion of limit where he doesn't. It's consistent with this other notion. Yes.
Muito obrigada a todos. Thank you so much for this.